Good morning, everyone. I wanted to do this video on how you could create a structured expression that would output values such as low, medium, series, or high, depending on where they would fall within a matrix such as this. What you're looking at here is a NAVSEA 5100.12m matrix, and this is for risks that have a specific frequency and probability by the severity level. So as you notice, that could be described using an enumeration list. So we have a list of enumerations in the model. What I did is create a profile that has a stereotype metaclass as a class with only two attributes. And the first one is the first axis for frequency and probability, and the second one is the second axis for severity. And then simply created two enumerations that have a list of enumeration literals, and that is essentially the same thing as a drop-down menu. So when we type those attributes and then give them a multiplicity of 1, we can also set a default value for what that would be if you were to create a new NAVSEA hazard. And then that is all nice, but what we really wanted to do is use this derived property here to output one of those specific low, medium, series, or high values depending on what we chose for these inputs. So to do that, we used a structured expression. And if I go to the specification for this, notice we have the name is the hazard level, but then I'm using an if then else statement to do this. The output type is string for this. We have a single value output, that is the multiplicity being 0 to 1. And then for the structured expression, this is the longest structured expression I've ever done, but it's because in that 7x7 matrix, we had to do an if and a then for each one of those. So that's essentially 49 different if-thens here. So if we start at the top, we're using an if-then-else statement, and then the condition is actually an and. So we reset this condition and went to the built-in operations, set that to an and that gives you these two input values. So and being the frequency and probability, and that is what is set for the first value. So if we look up frequency and probability, that first coordinate was the improbable by the severity level. And if we search for severity level, you can simply set these in your dropdown. Now, the next thing to do is set that then to a string. So if I were to reset this, you see right now it says then equals null, but you can go down here to string, and this is what it will output if those two conditions are true. So in this case, we have string and then low, which is simply a string value. The next thing to do is continue that pattern. So for the else, you can simply use another embedded if then else statement and do that exact same thing. So it's an if then else with the first condition being an and then going in and selecting your coordinates for that part of your matrix. And then this pattern does repeat all the way down to the very bottom, where you have an else that says NA or not applicable, but this is 49 if then else statements long, and it continues for quite a while. So this is probably the longest if then else statement I've ever done, but it works out very nicely when you put this into your model. After doing that, you end up having these outputs that look like this, and you can build this with a generic table that's based off of that stereotype element, and then of course scope that to whichever ones of these you'd like to pull in. Let's say we created a new one of these. We can give this a new name. We'll just call this something random here, and then you can go in and select your coordinates for where that would fall on your matrix. And then notice it outputs the hazard level here and color codes that accordingly. So for the legend, in order to output these colors, what you would do is go up to create legend. I recommend not doing extract legend from row type. In this case, only to create the legend. And then when you go to create the legend items, you can go to the specification. Of course, you have to set the adornment color for each of these. So for that, you just go to the fill color, select whichever color you'd like. And then this is very important. The constrained element you need to set to the stereotype. In this case, that's the NAVSEA hazard stereotype. And then down at the very bottom, this is where you actually put in the values that you'd like it to check for. So for elements by condition, it is a simple property test. And we're looking at that hazard level. So in this case, I entered in a string of low. So it's basically checking that that hazard level is low. And if it is, then it will color code that to green. But you also want to go and set that adorned property to the hazard level property. Otherwise, it's going to color that entire row. So if you'd like that entire row to be colored, then that is fine. Else, you would want to go in and actually select the row name by adorned property so that it's only applying that legend adornment to that one specific property instead of that entire row. I thought this was very interesting, so I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.